All right, here we go. So we're going to talk about types of memory. Um, and there's two we're going to talk about, explicit and implicit. So I'm going to start here with explicit or declarative. It's sometimes you might see it in different places. Basically the same kind of thing. So let's look at this. Explicit, there's actually, look, three different types. Semantic, explicit semantic, which is the recalling of facts. So if you're studying for something, you're studying, what are the stages of Erickson's theory? And those are the facts, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, recalling facts. Explicit episodic, remembering one episode of life. I stood there and looked at the Eiffel Tower. I remember that one episode. Explicit autobiographical. So many events of a similar kind in which we recall a sense of self over time. So our autobiographical memory gives us a narrative of who we are throughout time. And it can look at, who am I when I travel? Who am I with this particular friend? How, who am I in relationship to my experiences in life? And that's more of our autobiographical memory. Declarative, which is often used the same way, and as you can see these, use words to tell the story of an experience remembered. So facts, a lot of this has to do with our narrating of information. Okay, it's just different maybe kinds of information. So online by our second birthday. This is not, our explicit memory systems are not online right at birth. The foundation of some of them are, but they're not working to their full potential right at birth. So by the second birthday, it comes with maturation of language. And we'll talk a little bit more about why we don't remember our earliest things, but if you think about it, we don't have language, and so explicit memory could be a little tough if you can't speak. You cannot declare out into the world in order to make those things fire and wire continuously. It's harder. And maturation of certain parts of the brain, including the hippocampus and the orbitofrontal cortex. So we've mentioned these before. We're going to go back. We're going to do a little bit more with them. So the hippocampus is that cognitive mapper. It provides a sense of space and time, remembering where and when things were. So if you think about it for your autobiographical memory, that's going to be important because it's going to help you recall it's about who you were within a certain experience. So if it's the Eiffel Tower in Paris, what age was I? What was I going through? Who was I at that time? And that can help me put myself into that situation. This can also be really hard for little kids, though, because if they don't, especially before too, if our hippocampus is not online completely yet, it's not perfectly developed. And so we don't have as big a sense of time and space until that time, but also we're really little when we're looking at things, and the context of stuff can seem different when we're larger. Hippocampus also helps to consolidate short-term memory and move it into long-term memory. So autobiographical memory requires a sense of self, which we don't really have until starting about 18 months of age, which is called autognosis or self-knowing. So gnosis is just information. That's more of our explicit semantic stuff, just facts and just knowledge. Autognoic is knowledge of the self. And we don't really get this until later. So it's kind of hard to have autobiographical memory if you don't have a sense of self. It's dependent on development of the prefrontal cortex and areas of the social brain that work with the emotional brain, all of those things integrating together. So much of this, guys, is about the integration of the brain parts working together. That is so much what development is. How do we get an integrated brain where our social brain, our emotional brain, our thinking brain, our our action-oriented brain, our perceptual brain, all of it works together to our greatest good. That's an integrated brain, and that is a big goal of development. So these things come online slower. Some things come online slower than others. So advance our self-knowing and our autobiographical memory, but our sense of self advances through experience-dependent social learning in relationship with others in our first years. So as our social brain grows through our relationship with caregivers and the early people in our lives, we get experience-dependent learning, and that helps us create a sense of self, which goes towards our autobiographical memory. So encoding explicit memory, now this is really important, so listen up. Encoding explicit memory requires focused, directed, conscious attention, which activates the hippocampus. So if you want to really remember, I don't know where I went. If you want to really remember things, then you have to focus on them. That's why, like, when we try to study and we cannot recall what is Erickson's third stage of development, maybe we weren't focusing when we were reading that information. Activation of the hippocampus, which is so big in our explicit memory, requires our focused and conscious and directed attention. And so this is huge. And also, if you think about it, little children don't have a lot of this. Focused and directed and conscious attention at the age of 1 is not huge. So the hippocampus is not getting the opportunity to grow as much until we get a little bit older and we can use language and we get a little bit better at these things. It's all working together. Development leads to the opportunity to do that, and opportunity to do that leads to development. So to encode, stimuli is first placed in sensory memory. So it comes in through the thalamus, all of that, what we see, hear, taste, feel, all of that information is coming in. It only stays there for like a quarter to half a second. Initial neural activations take place in those perceptual systems. Visual, auditory, all of those little systems are going off and creating those initial engrams, that initial neural activation. Selected items then become, from huge sensory process, then placed in working memory. So if, you think about a baby trying to learn their name, like who they are, or an infant, and they hear a lot of sounds. And when they first come out of the womb, it's like, wah, whoa, blah. We probably sound like Charlie Brown's parents, wah, 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 wah. But a lot of different sounds. But over time, they can begin to pick out the ones that get repeated. And those carry some sort of meaning. And that meaning is activated. So that's selected out. And it can move into working memory. So chalkboard of the mind, where information that we are thinking about is placed to be used in the present. So this happens over time. And you think about it, when kids can start school, even preschool, they get a lot more opportunity to use these systems. When we consciously bring something to mind, so we try to remember Erickson's third stage. Working memory lets us bring current perceptions and past events together to manipulate them in our minds. So what do I think now? What's going on here that I'm trying to remember this? What do I remember about reading it? I can bring all these different things together. Info stays in working memory from 5 to 20 seconds unless practiced and can stay longer. So if you have to remember a phone number for a one-time use, it goes on that chalkboard, it's written down, and it's probably pretty quickly erased, right? Lateral prefrontal cortex is a major player in working memory. People with attention disorders have a harder time keeping things in working memory and have been shown to have abnormalities in the lateral prefrontal cortex. So think about it. If you're not able to pay attention to something, you don't activate the hippocampus as much, and therefore you cannot hold the information and encode it as strongly as those who can. When we continue to practice information working memory, it can move into long-term memory. When you try to recall something from a month ago, you're activating latent representations. So, like our trip to Paris, those are, you can think about those trace memories as sort of latent representations, those potentials for coming forward again. So we're trying to reactivate those. They're not going to be perfect, that we stored as potentials at the time. Long-term potentiation, high-frequency stimulation, so doing it over and over and over again, repeated firing and wiring over time, is going to move something into long-term memory. So if you talk about your trip to Paris a lot and all the things that happen and seeing the Eiffel Tower, it's going to become stronger and stronger. That neural net profile will grow and grow and grow. Just like if you read with focus Erickson's stages over and over, you will remember them better. That's the way it works. So a lot of this is encoding explicit memory. The memory about facts, the memory about, particular events that we were a part of and who we were in a part of that. So this is all about that, working memory, moving into long-term memory. Because implicit memory is very, very different. Explicit memory has a lot to do with remembering events of our lives and the details of those and kind of the general gist of those, and remembering facts like when we study, growing our vocabulary and knowledge about stuff. Implicit memory comes first, though I'm talking about it last, just because it is so big during our 0 to 2 time period, which is our first time period. So it's online in infants from the get-go. It does not require conscious processing during encoding or retrieval. Does not include the sense of remembering or consciously recalling something. Our implicit memories, it's not something we think about remembering, okay? The amygdala, so a lot of things are involved in our implicit memory systems. The amygdala for emotional memories, basal ganglia, cerebellum, and motor cortex for behavioral memory, perceptual or sensory cortices for perceptual memory, and our somatosensory cortex, our ACC, and our insula for bodily memory. The somatosensory cortex is like a mapping of all touch places in the body. So it maps everything that has to do with bringing in the sense of touch. The insula we've talked about in terms of the internal organs and how they are sensing something. So 2 types of implicit memory. One is procedural, and it comes through repetition and habits. It's unconscious, it's automatic motor-driven action. Riding a bike, walking. So, babies have the ability to learn these things, the ability to begin to regulate their reflexes from the get-go. That happens within the first couple of months of life. Things become less just reflexive and more coordinated over time, and that's procedural memory. It's just repeated over and over again in terms of behavior, and then becomes automatic. So you can think about like tying shoes. Over time, it becomes automatic. These are procedures that we learn to do. Emotional memories and perceptual memories. Implicit memory is very, very right brain oriented. The right brain is online first in babies and infants. We have a left brain, but it's not as strong. Our language centers are big in the left brain, logic, order, a lot of that explicit type of stuff. So right brain is much more functions in the world of nonverbal communication, reading faces, gestures, tone, smells. Babies do this very early. A baby comes out of the womb being more, preferring more tastes that the mother ate during pregnancy, knowing the mother's voice above other voices. So they come out. That is all implicit type of learnings. It's like very unconscious, just going in by way of experience, bypassing us having to think about it. It's just happening. It's getting encoded into the emotional, perceptual, motor parts of our brain as we experience things. So the bright brain is first online, more directly connected. There are more direct connections from the right brain to the insula, to our body state. So the right brain can more directly read the body. It's more directly related to the limbic centers. So it can more directly read the emotional states. And I will tell you, well, actually, I think I say it on the next one. Well, I will. So let's talk about that. So implicit memory and the development of the self, because that's what a lot of this has to do with. We use, in some sources, I see mental models. We use a lot, and we'll talk about this more with attachment and Bowlby, but the term working models, and they're very closely related. And schemas, which we talk about with Piaget. They're very basic components of our implicit memory. And we use them to quickly assess a situation based on the past to predict future outcomes. So what that means is that when we have experiences over and over again, we get we get like a model in our mind for how relationships work, for who we are within relationships, for how we treat people, for what a man is, for what a woman is, for what the world is like. We get just working, and we're not thinking about those things because this is happening in the first 2 years of life. We get impressions from the world that embed themselves into our emotional centers. So let's look at this. Implicit working models of early relationships are deeply encoded in the brain by the first birthday. That's pretty much all a baby has, are these first relationships, these early relationships. And that's their whole world. And so they become deeply encoded in the brain. And they're based on repeated patterns of interactions with caregivers. Implicit systems read facial cues, voice tone, emotion in microseconds. The amygdala can read and assess a situation as dangerous or not much faster, in microseconds, and faster microseconds than the cognitive brain, the thinking centers of the brain, can assess it. And so that will become encoded. So if it sees an angry look, even if it's only for a moment, it'll encode that. Gestures, things like this, repeated experience, ingrain emotional responses to them. So joy, safety, fear, terror, sadness. This is how our emotional centers become part of those neural pathways that link experience. So we link our ideas about a parent to that ingrained information that's coming in via these systems into the neural net profiles of the brain. Chronic occurrence makes the states more readily activated. Just so those, remember, we then store that potentiality for future activation. And in chronic occurrence makes them more readily activated. So, for example, well, say we have a great, wonderful caregiver who's very nurturing and loving, and we have a very secure attachment to them, which we'll talk more about in Chapter 7. But they make us feel good, they make us happy, we trust that they're going to come, and so forth. Those chronic occurrences of good things happening with them more readily activate our sort of joy centers and our expectation centers around around relationship with them. That creates a working model of relationships with people. Now, it can be different with different people, but we sort of also get this kind of whole gist of what it's like. But if we have if we have a traumatic kind of experience with caretakers, if our caretaker is the one that we're afraid of, then that actually can also become encoded in our systems. And and activate our fear response, activate our stress response, activate what we do. We learn to cope with that, activate those coping mechanisms very quickly. And in time, that can make them characteristic traits of that child. Okay. In a way, lives become shaped by reactivations of implicit memory without awareness of recalling events. So our implicit reactions become part of who we are without us even thinking about them. Our go-tos for stress are the way we respond to people, get encoded very early. We enter ingrained states and perceive them as present moment reality. So we have this sort of idea of relationships with people from very early encoding. And as we move through life, we come up in those potentials reactivate very quickly. We just sort of expect what we've always gotten. Right? And that's what we mean on it predicts future outcomes. We use the past to predict future outcomes about people, about ourselves, what we expect about ourselves. A lot of this goes into, as the last line says, implicit memory encoding shape the growing child's architecture of the self. So they also get an idea of who they are within relationship based upon their continued experience with other people. Okay. Again, hope that's making sense. All right, I'm going to pause this again and come back to a last few things about memory.